hate. It's a strong word, but in the NBA of the 1990s, it was real. Elbows flew, fights broke out. Every playoff series felt like war. And for Scottie Pippen, one of the greatest defenders and ultimate competitors in basketball history, there were players he simply couldn't stand. Pippen wasn't a trash talker by nature. He didn't need to put on a show. But he never forgot a cheap shot, a shove, or a moment of disrespect. He carried those grudges with him, and when the lights were brightest, you could see the fire in his eyes. If you crossed Scottie Pippen, you weren't just another opponent, you were a target. And that's what this countdown is all about. The 6 players Pippen hated the most. These weren't friendly rivalries, these were personal. Some came from the bruising wars against the Detroit Pistons. Some were finals rivals who tested his body and his patience. Others were Eastern Conference stars who battled him for supremacy in the 90s. And one was a former teammate who became the face of everything Pippen despised, about physical, bruising basketball. Over the next 6 chapters, we'll revisit the elbows, the fouls, the trash talk, and the unforgettable playoff clashes that built these grudges. From the bad boy who once sent Pippen crashing headfirst to the floor, to the sharpshooter who never stopped running his mouth, to the big men who bruised him in the paint, and finally, to the one player he truly hated most. And trust me, you cannot miss the last name on this list. Because while most fans might expect Pippen's greatest rivalries to come from legendary opponents like Karl Malone or Patrick Ewing, the truth is far more personal. The final player on this list isn't just someone Pippen battled on the court, it's someone whose very presence symbolized betrayal, bad blood, and battles that cut deeper than any other. This is Top 6 Basketball Players Scottie Pippen hated the most. Stay with us until the end, because the number 1 spot is the one that will shock you the most. Dennis Rodman. Before Dennis Rodman ever wore a Chicago Bulls jersey, he wore the black hat in Scottie Pippen's story. In the late 80s and early 90s, Rodman was the face of the Detroit Pistons' bad boys, and his mission was simple: make life miserable for Michael Jordan and Scottie Pippen. Rodman didn't just play defense, he played demolition. He pushed, he grabbed, he clawed, and he fouled harder than anyone else in the league. And no one felt his wrath more than Pippen. In fact, one of the most infamous moments of Pippen's career came courtesy of Rodman. It was Game 4 of the 1991 Eastern Conference Finals. Chicago was on the verge of finally breaking through after years of playoff heartbreak against Detroit. Pippen drove hard to the basket, and Rodman shoved him from behind. Pippen went flying, smashed to the floor, and came up bleeding from his chin. It was a cheap shot, and it infuriated him. He later said it was one of the dirtiest plays he ever experienced, and it only fueled his hatred for Rodman and the Pistons. But this wasn't a one-time incident. Every Bulls-Pistons game was a war. Rodman was relentless, hounding Pippen on every possession, daring him to lose his cool. The Pistons called it the Jordan rules, but Pippen was just as much a target. They tried to break him physically and mentally, and Rodman was their weapon of choice. When Chicago finally swept Detroit in 1991, it wasn't just victory, it was revenge. For Pippen, beating Rodman and the Pistons was like lifting a weight off his shoulders. And when the Pistons famously walked off the court without shaking hands, it cemented the bitterness. Pippen said later that he felt no sympathy for them, and certainly none for Rodman. That's why it shocked the basketball world when Rodman joined the Bulls in 1995. Suddenly the man Pippen hated most was sitting in the same locker room. At first it was awkward. Pippen admitted he wasn't sure he could ever trust Rodman. But winning heals almost anything, and Rodman's rebounding and defense were too valuable to ignore. Together they went on to win 3 championships. Still, even with those victories, the scars of the past never faded. To Pippen, Rodman would always be tied to the bruises, the cheap shots, and the pain of those Pistons wars. He may have become a teammate, but he'll forever be remembered as one of the players Pippen hated the most. Charles Barkley. If Scottie Pippen had problems with Dennis Rodman on the court, his feud with Charles Barkley was something else entirely. It was public, it was personal, and it never really went away. The tension between the two stars dated back to the early 90s, when Barkley's Suns and Pippen's Bulls collided in the 1993 NBA Finals. Barkley had just won league MVP, and he was hungry to prove he could beat Jordan and Pippen on the biggest stage. The series was physical and high-scoring, but Chicago came out on top in 6 games. Pippen never forgot how Barkley carried himself during that run, often portraying himself as Jordan's equal. For Pippen, that arrogance didn't sit well, but the real drama came later. After Jordan's second retirement in 1998, Pippen left Chicago and was traded to the Houston Rockets. Suddenly he was teammates with Barkley and Hakeem Olajuwon, 3 Hall of Famers chasing one last ring together. On paper, it looked unstoppable. In reality, it was a disaster. Pippen lasted just 1 season in Houston, and his relationship with Barkley completely imploded. He accused Barkley of being selfish, out of shape, and unwilling to sacrifice for the team. In one infamous interview, Pippen said, "I probably should have listened to Michael Jordan a long time ago when he said Charles will never win a championship because he doesn't show any dedication." He even called Barkley fat and lazy. Barkley fired back, blasting Pippen for quitting on the Rockets and claiming he wasn't committed to the team's success. The feud became headline news, with both men slinging insults in the press. Unlike many basketball grudges that fade with time, this one only seemed to get worse. Even decades later, the two still take shots at each other whenever the topic comes up. For Pippen, Barkley represented the kind of player he despised, talented but undisciplined, entertaining but not committed enough to winning. Pippen prided himself on versatility, defense, and sacrifice, qualities he felt Barkley lacked. That contrast turned respect into resentment, and eventually into open hatred. And unlike Rodman, with whom Pippen eventually found common ground, there was never reconciliation with Barkley. No handshake, no forgiveness, just a feud that still burns long after both careers ended. That's why Charles Barkley earns a spot on Pippen's list of most hated players. Karl Malone. Game 1 of the 1998 NBA Finals. The Chicago Bulls versus the Utah Jazz. Scottie Pippen is fighting through back spasms so painful he can barely bend over, yet he's still on the floor. And then comes Karl Malone, throwing elbows, posting up hard, and making every possession a war. For Pippen, Malone wasn't just an opponent. He was a rival. He truly hated battling. The bad blood had roots the year before. In 1997, Malone beat out Michael Jordan for league MVP, a decision that infuriated the Bulls' locker room. Jordan took it personally, and so did Pippen. When the Bulls met the Jazz in the finals, the stakes were clear. Prove who the real MVP was. Chicago won the series in 6, but Malone's bruising style left its mark. Pippen had to guard him on switches, and every time he did, it felt like colliding with a brick wall. By 1998, the tension had only grown. Malone was still the Jazz's workhorse, and he leaned on every trick he had. One moment in Game 2 is etched in Pippen's memory. Malone swung his elbow and caught Pippen in the head, sending him staggering. It wasn't called a flagrant foul, but Pippen believed it was dirty. He said later that Malone was reckless with his elbows and made no effort to protect players around him. Beyond the physical pain, Pippen hated Malone's swagger. Nicknamed the Mailman because he always delivered, Malone relished his reputation as the league's Iron Man. To Pippen, it felt like arrogance. He saw a player who put up huge stats but couldn't close the deal when it mattered most. The Bulls beat Malone and the Jazz in back-to-back finals, and Pippen never missed a chance to remind people of it. Off the court, things weren't much better. Pippen bristled at Malone's public persona, including his comments and antics that often drew headlines. He saw Malone as a player who loved the spotlight, but shied away from accountability when his team fell short. In the end, Malone embodied everything Pippen hated in a rival: physical cheap shots, an inflated reputation, and the bitterness of finals battles that could have gone either way. Beating him twice on the biggest stage was sweet revenge, but the bruises and the grudge never really faded. That's why Karl Malone has a permanent place on Scottie Pippen's list of most hated players. Ewing. Some rivalries are about words, others are about bruises. But the rivalry between Scottie Pippen and Patrick Ewing was about humiliation. And nothing summed it up better than one unforgettable dunk in the 1994 NBA playoffs. It was Game 6 of the Eastern Conference semifinals. The Knicks were up in the series, looking to knock out the Bulls for the first time since the dynasty began. Midway through the game, Pippen caught the ball on the wing, attacked the basket, and rose right over Ewing, slamming down one of the most vicious dunks of the decade. But it didn't end there. Pippen stood over Ewing, stared him down, and barked in his face before jogging back on defense. The message was clear. I don't like you, and I'm not afraid to show it. That moment wasn't just highlight reel drama. It was the boiling point of years of battles. The Knicks and Bulls met in the playoffs 5 times between 1989 and 1996, and every series was a war. The games were low-scoring, defensive slugfests where every rebound felt like life and death. And at the center of it all was Ewing, the Knicks anchor, and the player Pippen was tasked with frustrating. Pippen never held back when talking about Ewing. He admitted he respected his talent, but he couldn't stand his style of play. To Pippen, Ewing was plodding, predictable, and the poster child for a Knicks team that relied more on brute force than skill. He often mocked Ewing's inability to get over the hump, reminding reporters that for all his battles, the Knicks never managed to take Chicago down when Jordan and Pippen were together. The hatred wasn't one-sided. Ewing bristled at Pippen's swagger, especially after that dunk and taunt in '94. The two clashed physically and verbally in nearly every series. Knicks fans despised Pippen, and Pippen relished every chance to silence Madison Square Garden with a dagger 3 or a defensive stop. What made this rivalry sting was that it wasn't abstract. It was personal. Ewing was the obstacle standing between the Bulls and the finals, and Pippen hated everything he represented. A rival city, a rival big man, and a rival team that played dirty but couldn't close. By the time the Bulls finally dispatched the Knicks for the last time in 1996, Pippen had gotten what he wanted. Dominance, revenge, and the satisfaction of knowing Ewing would never beat him when it mattered most. And maybe that was the ultimate insult, that despite all the Knicks' punches, hard fouls, and intimidation, Patrick Ewing never stood on top while Pippen was around. Reggie Miller. Scottie Pippen hated cheap shots. He hated arrogance. But more than anything, he hated trash talkers. And that's why Reggie Miller made his blood boil. Miller wasn't the biggest, strongest, or fastest player. What he had was a mouth that never stopped running and a jumper that always seemed to fall when it mattered most. Every time the Bulls faced the Indiana Pacers, Pippen knew he was in for a long night. Not because Miller was impossible to guard, but because he never shut up. The peak of their rivalry came in the 1998 Eastern Conference Finals. The Bulls were chasing their 6th championship, and the Pacers pushed them to the edge. It was the toughest series Chicago played in that entire dynasty run. In Game 4, with seconds left, Miller shoved Michael Jordan out of the way, caught the ball, and drilled a game-winning 3. He sprinted back down the court screaming, arms waving, feeding off the roar of the Indiana crowd. Pippen never forgot it. But Miller's antics weren't just for the cameras. He was constantly in players' ears, needling them, trying to get under their skin. Pippen, who prided himself on composure and discipline, despised that approach. He felt Miller was more showman than soldier, always trying to stir things up instead of just playing the game. Physically, Miller was a challenge too. He ran off endless screens, never stopped moving, and forced defenders like Pippen to chase him all night. By the 4th quarter, your legs were gone, and then he'd hit you with a dagger 3. For a player like Pippen, who valued hard-nosed defense and team-first play, Miller's cocky celebrations and constant chatter made every loss feel like salt in the wound. What made it worse was that Miller wasn't afraid to go directly at Pippen. In one infamous exchange, Miller got tangled with him under the basket, and the two had to be separated as they jawed back and forth. Miller thrived on that chaos, but Pippen saw it as cheap provocation. The Bulls won that 1998 series in 7 games, but it was anything but easy. Even in victory, Pippen admitted the Pacers had given them their toughest fight. And at the center of it all was Reggie Miller, the irritant who made every possession personal. To Pippen, Miller wasn't just a rival, he was the embodiment of everything annoying, arrogant, and infuriating about the NBA. And for that, he'll forever hold a place near the top of Pippen's most hated list. Charles Oakley. For Scottie Pippen, grudges weren't always about rivals on the other side of the country. Sometimes, the hardest feelings came from inside his own circle. And no player represented that better than Charles Oakley, the man Pippen came to hate most. The irony is that Oakley started as a friend. Drafted by the Bulls in 1985, Oakley quickly became Michael Jordan's bodyguard and an enforcer for the young Chicago team. He was physical, fearless, and never backed down from anyone. Pippen joined in 1987, and the two shared a locker room for just one season before the Bulls traded Oakley to the New York Knicks for center Bill Cartwright. It was a move that gave Chicago the size they needed to win championships. But it also lit the fuse for years of bitterness. Once Oakley became a Knick, the dynamic changed completely. He went from teammate to tormentor. Every Bulls-Knicks game turned into a war, and Oakley relished going after Pippen. He was physical to the point of violence, hard fouls, elbows, and constant shoves designed to knock Pippen off his game. Unlike some players who talked big but shied away from confrontation, Oakley wanted it, and Pippen was always in the crosshairs. The early 90s Knicks-Bulls battles were legendary. From 1992 to 1996, they met in the playoffs 5 times, and Oakley was at the center of every clash. He set bone-crunching screens, hammered players on drives, and made the paint a dangerous place. For Pippen, who prided himself on finesse, versatility, and intelligence, Oakley's brute force style felt like an insult to the game itself. One story players still tell: Oakley once leveled Pippen so hard on a drive that he needed stitches after the game. The foul wasn't even called flagrant, it was just 90s basketball. Pippen despised it. To him, Oakley wasn't just playing tough, he was crossing the line, and the referees let him get away with it. The hatred deepened because of their shared past. Oakley knew Pippen's tendencies, his strengths and weaknesses, and he used that insider knowledge against him. It wasn't just Knicks versus Bulls, it was personal. Pippen later admitted that going against Oakley was one of the most exhausting matchups of his career. Not because of skill, but because of the constant pounding. Off the court, the tension never really eased. Unlike Dennis Rodman, with whom Pippen eventually found respect, Oakley remained a sore spot. He represented betrayal, a guy who once wore the same jersey but became one of the fiercest thorns in Chicago's side. And for Bulls fans, Oakley's physical bullying was unforgettable. By the time Chicago had firmly established its dynasty in the mid-90s, Pippen had gotten the better of Oakley on the scoreboard. The Bulls won titles, the Knicks fell short, but even victory didn't erase the hatred. Pippen still carried the scars, literal and figurative, of the battles Oakley waged against him. And that's what makes Charles Oakley stand apart from everyone else on this list. With Rodman, there was reconciliation. With Barkley and Malone, the bitterness was mostly professional. With Reggie Miller, it was annoyance and irritation. But with Oakley, it was personal, physical, and permanent. Scottie Pippen hated playing against Charles Oakley more than anyone else. And when you look back at the blood, the bruises, and the bad blood of the Bulls-Knicks rivalry, it's not hard to see why. When you look back at Scottie Pippen's career, you see a player who built his reputation on discipline, defense, and doing the dirty work that wins championships. But along the way, he also built a list of grudges, and those grudges tell us just as much about Pippen as his victories do. From Dennis Rodman, the bad boy who once sent him crashing headfirst to the floor, to Charles Barkley, the so-called teammate he blasted as fat and selfish. From Karl Malone's sharp elbows in the finals, to Patrick Ewing's bruising battles in Madison Square Garden. From Reggie Miller's endless trash talk, to Charles Oakley's betrayal as a former Bull turned bitter rival, each name on this list reveals a different side of Pippen's fire. What unites them all is simple: disrespect. Pippen hated players who tried to bully him, overshadow him, or show him up. And because he was the ultimate competitor, he never let those moments go. They became fuel. Every foul, every shove, every insult stuck with him. And when the time came, he made sure to answer back with defense, with dunks, and with wins. But if there's one takeaway from this countdown, it's that Pippen's hate wasn't weakness. It was power. It drove him to push harder, to play tougher, and to make sure that when history was written, his name was carved into it alongside the greatest. And in that sense, even the players he hated the most helped make him who he was. So here's the question. Which of these rivalries do you think burned the brightest? Was it the pain of Rodman's cheap shots, the finals wars with Malone, or the bitterness that never healed with Oakley? Let us know in the comments. We want to hear your take. This has been Top 6 basketball players Scottie Pippen hated the most. Thanks for watching. And if you love diving into the grudges, rivalries, and untold stories that shape the game, make sure to subscribe to Game 7 Stories. Because every legend has rivals, and every rivalry leaves a story worth telling.